Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Scott Jones. I'm a principal at Trade&Secure LLC, and it is my honor and privilege to be with you today to discuss the topics of export control and foreign direct investment regulatory changes in China. In addition to those topics, we also wanted to touch on recent regulatory changes and developments in what we would call the counter sanctions and emerging sanctions list categories, both two designations relatively new to Chinese trade control and regulatory practices. Now, before getting into the individual topics, we wanted to note the context in which these developments are taking place, as they provide much of the rationale and therefore understanding as to the current trends in Chinese trade and security regulatory revisions. It's really within the past 5 years that the Chinese government has increased the number and type of regulations pertaining to trade and related security issues. In particular, Beijing has issued new or revised existing regulations relating to, as we've noted, export controls, foreign direct investment controls, specifically the national security review process for proposed deals and transactions. And within the FDI space, we've seen an expansion and further clarification as to what constitutes a so-called strategic economic sector, as well as the national security review process itself. In other words, a further elucidation of that process. And more recently, we've even seen what we would call a US-style emergence of a sanctions regime in the form of the recent counter-sanctions regulation and some of the accompanying sanctions lists. In general, the primary drivers for these recent regulatory developments include protection of indigenously produced technology, as well as the changing strategic relations with the United States. Now, regarding export control reform, perhaps the most noteworthy development we've seen in the past several years has been the articulation and finalization of the comprehensive export control law that was drafted and enacted last year. Specifically, the law entered into force on the 1st of December of last year. And importantly to note, and a theme I will return to throughout the presentation, is the fact that the implementing regulations have yet to be introduced. We're expecting some of the first regulations regarding implementing the export control law towards the end of the year in late Q4. Now, interestingly, this has been an ongoing process since approximately 2015, when the State Council first reached out to the Chinese Ministry of Commerce, or MOFCOM, and requested that they develop a comprehensive export control law to replace the then existing system, which was composed of a large number of various legal vehicles that provided the authority for the then export control system in China. And you can see in this graphic here some of the earlier regulations that constituted what we will now refer to as the old export control system. So you can see no less than 10 measures, decrees, orders, and regulations related to various aspects of export control, including control over military items, so-called dual-use items, nuclear items, chemical, missile, etc. So the ultimate achievement of the comprehensive law was precisely that, to make the system comprehensive and unified under one legal vehicle. And that's what we have in the current export control law. Now, I'd like to move into a discussion of a few of the more salient or important aspects of the export control law. The first of which is to address the administrative side or the bureaucracy of the export control system as envisioned in the export control law. And the specifics for what the State Council refers to as the Export Control Administration is a power that's delegated to the State Council and the Central Military Commission, which charges those two bodies with identifying what is in essence going to be the licensing agencies for the export control system. Now, in speaking with people in Beijing, we've come to learn that we don't expect to see any change to the bureaucracy when compared to the older system in terms of who is issuing a license for what commodities. Specifically, we expect to see the Ministry of Commerce, specifically the Bureau of Industrial Safety and Import and Export Control, to continue to issue licenses for dual-use goods. And likewise, for military exports, we expect to see the State Administration for Science, Technology, and Industry for National Defense, or SASTIN, to continue the licensing process for defense exports. Now, in terms of controlled items, the law defines those items as the following: dual-use military products or defense items, nuclear goods, and other goods, technologies, services, and items that are related to the protection of national security and interests or the fulfillment or non-proliferation or other international obligations. So again, we see here the full extent of the comprehensiveness of the new law, which basically takes all of those earlier individual pieces of legislation and wraps them into one unified legal instrument. And that is captured in the definition of controlled goods. What's a new development with respect to the law and controlled goods is that the final draft of the law extended the definition of controlled items to encompass, quote, data such as technical documentation relating to items. Now, in doing some more research on this particular aspect, the intangible or technology side of controlled items in the law, in looking at Chinese analysis and some of the media reports on this subject, they suggest that this amendment ensures that source code, things like algorithms, and similar data are clearly subject to export controls. So in contrast to the earlier model or the earlier system, there was not a lot of clarity or focus articulated on the technology piece. Now technology figures from a control perspective very prominently in the new law. Now, it's important to note, however, that the law itself does not prescribe the format, the methodology, or scope through which the various authorities might define the controlled items subject to export controls within their respective jurisdiction. Now, as I mentioned, for some of what I would refer to as the traditional export control items, dual use, military, chemical, missile, they will be controlled by the respective major licensing agencies, MOFCOM and SASTIN. And as you'll see in just a moment, some of this ambiguity surrounding new areas of control and who will be controlling it relates to the fact that technology itself is changing very rapidly. And in the context of US-China relations, what we refer to as strategic technology is also, from a definitional standpoint, changing very quickly as well. Now, in terms of covered transaction, what is the scope of the law with respect to the movement of goods? The law defines export controls as restrictions on transfers of controlled items from Chinese territory to overseas, standard definition of export. It also includes the fact that the provision of controlled items by any citizen or incorporated or non-incorporated organization of or in China to any foreign organization or individual is also subject to the covered transactions of this law. And I'll say more about that dimension in just a moment. The law also mentions, in contrast to some of the earlier pieces of legislation, the coverage or the extension of export control coverage to free zones, free trade areas, special economic zones, export processing zones. And this is largely due to the commercial reality in China, the fact that free trade zones figure so prominently in economic planning and indeed in the economic day-to-day reality of moving goods in and out of China. Chances are you will be dealing with a free zone in some shape or form at some point. So this proviso extends or articulates that the law covers indeed the sovereign and customs territory of the People's Republic of China. Now, if we go back to that second definition in the first bullet of controlling items to any foreign organization or individual, this would suggest that parties can be held liable for engaging in unlicensed transaction involving movement of controlled items outside of China. And I'll say more about this in just a moment, because this speaks to a couple of issues, one of which is potential re-export control, which would be a new development, certainly a very new development for the Chinese export control system. Continuing on covered transactions, the laws, restrictions, and licensing requirements also expand to a broad range of conducted transactions, one of which I just mentioned, re-exports. And within that, there may also be controls on what we would call retransfers, or the movement of a good from a designated exporter in a country to another commercial entity in the same country may potentially be subject to control. We don't know yet. Again, if I can remind you at the beginning, I said it's important to understand that there's still quite a bit we don't know about how the law will appear in the actual implementing regulations, and this is one area. Also, given the expansive definition of controlled items to include technologies, data, disclosure of controlled technology to third persons may in fact be treated as exports. So this would be very similar to what in the US we refer to as a deemed export, when a technology, the export of which would otherwise require licensing were it to be physically exported. If that information is conveyed within China, it may require licensing. Again, we don't know quite yet what that will actually look like in practice. The law also speaks to unlisted items. It includes what to many of us familiarly appears as a catch-all clause, and that existed in the earlier system as well. Interestingly, the law also includes a designation called temporary controls. Specifically, the temporary controls allows in consultation with the State Council or the Central Military Commission, again, the lead agencies for designating how and who will be involved in the system. The export control authorities, be it MOFCOM or SASTN, for example, may impose temporary export controls, critically of no more than 2 years over certain goods and technologies that they deem to be sensitive or strategic in nature. Now, what's interesting here is that 2-year control period. We're seeing something very similar in the United States with respect to the identification of emerging technologies. That when an emerging technology is identified in the United States and is put on a control list, the government only has 3 years, complete 3 years, to either get that item on one of the regime control lists, be it BASNAR or MTCR, or it has to remove it from the control list, or it has to provide a rationale as to why it will be kept on the control list as a unilateral control. So that looks like a similar dispensation with respect to temporary controls in China. Also, there's quite a bit of focus on end use and end user controls in the law. In fact, the law requires exporters to provide the designated authorities with end user and or end use certification documentation when exporting controlled items. This, again, is a common feature of other export control systems around the world. Most systems don't require end use certificates for all exports, mostly for military exports, in fact, in some cases for dual use. And in this case, we don't know if this will be a universal application for all dual use or sensitive exports from China, or higher risk as determined by the governing authority. In tandem with that, the export control authorities are also responsible for developing what they call a risk management system to evaluate, examine, and strengthen oversight of the controlled items, end use, and end users. And to accompany that will be some form of a end user list. And that will be a end user list of high risk end users specifically. And we don't quite know, again, how this list will manifest and how it relates to some of the other lists we'll be talking to in just a moment, but we'll return to that concept. So on the lists, I think as many of you may have heard, last year, the government announced something called the provisions on the list of unreliable entities, under which blacklisted entities would be restricted or prevented from business transaction in and with Chinese entities. So far, we only have the provision. We don't have the actual list. The provision simply gave the government, in this case specifically MOFCOM, the power to create the list, but the list has not been created yet. We also don't know to what extent this law will, if at all, be officially connected to the export control issue. In fact, the entity list is not referenced in the export control law whatsoever. Furthermore, as I just mentioned in the context of end users, Article 18 of the law requires the creation of a control list for importers and end users of concern. So we don't know how these two lists will work together, or if it will be like a US style system where the US has multiple export control lists for different purposes. Another major theme in the law is the reference to internal compliance and its central importance for exporters. In fact, the law suggests that exporters within an effective internal compliance program could benefit from certain what they call convenient measures, such as being granted general licenses. Now, the law does not say that you'll get a general license if you have an internal compliance program. It simply gives that as an example. And we would expect to see something like that articulated in the implementing regulations. Very topically and quite recently, MOFCOM promulgated its first ICP guidelines in over 14 years. The so-called guiding opinions of MOFCOM on ICP systems is basically a recitation of what we would all recognize as global best practices and standards on ICP programs for exporters, composed of 9 or 10 elements, referencing elements such as the importance and centrality of a screening system, training, record keeping, reporting violations, ensuring management commitment and compliance. So it looks very familiar to its peer guidance from various governments around the world. So in summary, and most importantly, there's still a lot we don't know, but compared to other export control systems, the new law is very much a part of what we would recognize in Korea or the United States or Japan or in Europe as a law with the necessary elements to execute and realize a comprehensive national export control system. It has the necessary elements, catch-all, focus on end user, the centrality of control lists, a licensing process, enforcement authorities, but we don't know what it will look like in practice. We don't know the details yet. And that, as I said, will come out in the implementing regulations. Consequently, foreign subsidiaries doing business in China should monitor how the government further regulates the control lists and the required documentation for export license and end user certifications. And we're expecting to see that regulatory picture painted very soon. Also, businesses that rely on goods and technologies or services from China should carefully evaluate supply chain risks in light of the law and its potential implementation. And certainly businesses currently doing business with China should develop compliance programs to comply with the new law and therefore minimize risk. Noting in particular the recent MOFCOM ICP guidance would be a very useful place to start. Now, moving on to foreign direct investment. There's been quite a bit of activity just within the past couple of years, up until about 2016, 2017, where there was various drafts of the foreign investment law emerging for public comment. Prior to that, the Chinese operated a fairly simple system of FDI control from a national security perspective on the basis of what they call their negative list system. And the negative list contained companies and industry sectors in which it was either prohibited or restricted for foreign direct investment. That there wasn't really a formal national security review process like there is, for instance, in the United States or Korea, to assess the national security implications of investing in certain sectors. So with this batch of new law and implementing regulations, what we see here is the development of very much of what we would recognize, at least from a US perspective, of what we refer to as a CFIUS, or Committee on Foreign Investment in the US style system that, again, is much more nuanced and sophisticated than the old negative list system. Now, under the recent regulations, what we've seen is that a national security review trigger has, or the means by which a national security review is triggered, that's become expanded. And that really has a lot to do with the fact that the term foreign investment itself has been expanded and now refers to foreign investors' direct or indirect investment in Chinese economic activities in China, and includes the following situations or scenarios. One, a single foreign investor or jointly with other investors investing in new construction, for example, greenfield investing in China, or through the establishment of a new business. Second, foreign investors acquiring equity or capital of domestic enterprises through classic mergers and acquisition. And lastly, foreign investors investing in China through other means, and that's usually portfolio investing. These measures, the recent implementing measures for the foreign investment law, no longer distinguish between foreign invested enterprises and non-foreign invested enterprises. Under the law, a foreign investment only included setting up FIEs, or foreign invested enterprises, and investing in projects. Now, a broader range of investing is potentially subject to national security reviews. Again, I think this is consistent with what we're seeing globally in terms of national governments looking at the FDI national security review regime, largely because our understanding of what constitutes a strategic industry is now changing rapidly. And that's certainly the case in China as well. Now, in terms of affected sectors, investments in the following will be subject to a mandatory national security review. No surprises in the first category, military and military related. These are the so-called strategic or traditional strategic industries and economic sectors. And in this particular sector, there is no percentage or control threshold for foreign investment in military-related FDI. So if you were just taking a 1% interest in a military-related company, you would still have to undergo a national security review. Another relevant sector, the acquisition of effective control of enterprises in the areas of, and I'll get to the concept of important in just a moment, some key recently added economic sectors to the national security review process. Important, for instance, transportation services, information technology and internet product and service companies, financial services, energy and related resources. And these are so-called important. And again, I'll get to important in just a moment. Now, in the implementing measures, the use of the term important to qualify products, services, and areas that may attract national security review, there's not a lot of detail provided in the measures. The measures basically say that the government will tell you what's important on the basis of the broad economic sectors I just illustrated on the previous slides. Also, in contrast to that, what's interesting is effective control is actually spelled out in quite some detail. And I've listed the three categories or types of effective control, all of which are meant to convey the ability of the investor to transfer technology. That's really the focus, and that's the defining feature of what effective control means. Does the investor have the ability to draw the intellectual property and transfer the technology outside of China? And that's really the three variations that you see here in these definitions of effective control. But again, important is what the government says it is. So it's not always clear. Now, in terms of filings and penalties, as noted in the foreign investment law, filings are voluntary. However, the government, through the newly created working mechanism, this is basically the administrative body that conducts the review that's composed of interagency representatives, and it can require on an ad hoc basis filings, and it can also unwind previously consummated deals. And that's a very important aspect of the implementing measures, is basically saying, look, the government, even after you finalize the deal, and this could be 2 weeks later, this can be 2 years later, as we've seen in the United States, can unwind the deal and require the investor to sell their controlling interest or stake in the company. In contrast to the previous national review system, filings will be made to the NDRC and not the Ministry of Commerce. And this is just an administrative change. Nothing substantively has changed here. Also, prior to filing an application, the parties may consult with the working mechanism as an informal review exercise. So the outside investor can approach the working mechanism in advance and say, is this deal viable? What's the likelihood that it could undergo a successful national security review? So that's actually a very flexible aspect from the investor's perspective that's available in the new regulations. Further considerations on FDI controls, again, much in the same way with export control. We expect to see further clarifications over the next couple of quarters. As it's currently issued by the NDRC and MOFCOM, and these are the two primary agencies involved in the mechanism. The implementing measures for the foreign investment laws are expected to have a material impact on foreign capital's entry into China, particularly considering the increasing international focus on emerging technologies as a security concern. Also, in the interim, we strongly advise investors seeking further investment access to thoroughly acquaint themselves with the new measure while awaiting further guidance from the working mechanism. So lastly, to discuss a couple very recent trade and security regulatory actions we've seen, It's important to note, again, referencing earlier to the promulgation of the unreliable entities list last year, that more recently, Beijing has also identified a number of other lists of individuals, lists of companies that are subject to some type of economic prohibition or control. Now, as I said earlier, with respect to the unreliable entities list, we still haven't seen who's going to be on the list, what it looks like, and what it means in practice. But the fact that it's been put on the table as a legal reality, again, is another factor that we have to consider as a risk to be managed. More recently, in fact, earlier this month in June, on June 10th, in fact, the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress enacted something called the Anti-Foreign Sanctions Law. And this law empowers government departments under the State Council to designate persons or entities involved in developing, issuing, or implementing another country's sanctions targeting China. Another way to describe this legislation is counter-sanctions. And the precedent for this obviously comes from the European Union, which first put in place its counter-sanctions in the mid-90s against the United States, which basically created a legal recourse for companies that were put in an awkward situation vis-a-vis European law and US law or extraterritorial law with respect to honoring sanctions or not. This new law permits extensive countermeasures, including things like visa bans, freezing or seizure of property in China, and transaction restrictions. Also, the law provides for broad targeting, for example, senior managers of listed entities and even the families of listed individuals that may be subject to countermeasures as well. Also, the law is quite broad in its geographic reach. It covers Hong Kong and Macau and may, according to the way the law is generally written, may apply extraterritorially. This new law represents indeed a significant expansion of Chinese efforts to push back against US sanctions and certainly goes beyond the January 2021 rules on blocking unjustified extraterritorial application of foreign legislation and other measures issued by MOFCOM. And that was issued largely in response to US listing, in particular of Huawei, in addition to other Chinese companies as well. The law also requires that the State Council create a centralized mechanism to coordinate countermeasures across the Chinese government interagency. Some analysts have actually gone so far as to call this potentially the Chinese Office of Foreign Asset Control, or OFAC, which is the primary sanctions coordination body for the US government. Also noteworthy is earlier in the year, China announced, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs formally announced travel sanctions against several US senators in response to their proposed legislation on Chinese human rights abuses. So again, as we've seen across export control, foreign direct investment, and now with sanctions and counter sanctions, the Chinese government is expanding its legal capability to pursue all strategic economic and trade options in the context of foreign policy. It is perhaps useful to conclude this discussion of trade and security related policy changes in China by focusing on recent public statements by the chairman of the National People's Congress, Li Zhaoshu. And Chairman Li recently noted that China would enhance legislation in foreign related fields by focusing on policies against sanctions and what he referred to as foreign interference, as well as countering long-arm jurisdiction and expanding, again, what he referred to as the legal toolbox for addressing foreign-related risks. And Chairman Li's public statements on these matters, I think nicely summarizes the collective Chinese government thinking on issues related to trade and security, and indeed explains the regulatory changes that we've seen across export control, FDI, and sanctions related regulatory activities we've seen over the past couple of years. This recent announcement is in fact part of a larger trend characterized by increased state involvement in safeguarding Chinese technology through trade and investment controls, while responding to US as well as other governments' economic pressure in the form of sanctions, tariffs, and export controls. As I've mentioned throughout the presentation, that we still don't understand the full scope and effect of these actions and countermeasures. But what we do know, and what is perfectly clear now, is that international companies may be at risk in the future of being caught between competing US and Chinese demands, and developments in this area will need to be very closely monitored. So with that, I'd like to conclude the presentation, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your time and attention. And I'd also like to thank my friends at KOSTI, the organizers of this event. Have a good day.